Okay, my name's Joan DeBard-Levin, and I'm here with Achim Hurrelmann of Carleton University to talk about European Union enlargement. Thanks very much for being here. The first question is, how has the EU enlarged over the course of its history, and how has this process been significant for European Union integration?
So enlargement means adding new member states to the European Union or its predecessor institutions. And that has been one of the main trajectories of European integration. As you know, only 6 states founded the original European communities: France, Italy, West Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And all of the other member states have joined since then through a process of enlargement. In the 1970s, the UK, Ireland, and Denmark. In the 1980s, Greece, Spain, and Portugal. In the 1990s, Austria, Sweden, and Finland. Then in 2004, 10 new member states, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Visegrad states, Hungary, Poland, Czechia, and Slovakia, Slovenia, as well as Cyprus and Malta. 2007, Romania and Bulgaria joined, and in 2013, Croatia, bringing the EU's membership up to 28 member states. And then, of course, with Brexit, the UK's withdrawal, it dropped down to 27 member states. Why is enlargement important? I think there are at least 3 reasons why it's important. First of all, as Charles Penton has pointed out in his chapter, it underscores the attractiveness of the European Union for new member states that want to join. Secondly, it makes the EU a more powerful player globally because of its larger size, and also because the enlargement process gives the EU some influence on states that want to join. And thirdly, it has made the EU a more diverse actor internally, more diverse economically, more diverse culturally, and also more difficult to govern. So this internal dimension of enlargement has really shaped how the EU has developed as a political system.
Are there any topics of similarity between the EU and Canada in the area of enlargement?
Well, at the superficial level there are, because Canada as well was founded originally only by a subset of today's provinces: Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, and all of the other provinces have come in later or have been created later. But one key difference that we need to understand is that states joining the European Union are sovereign states in the international state system, and not post-colonial entities or colonies like the provinces that were added to the Canadian Confederation. And what that means is that these states have a history of being independent, and joining the European Union for them means giving up some of their sovereignty for the benefits of being in the EU and exercising power within the EU. But this is a process that can be sometimes quite controversial within states that seek to join.
What are the conditions that states aspiring to join the EU have to fulfill, and how are decisions made within the European Union about enlargement?
The EU has defined these conditions. They are called Copenhagen criteria because they were drawn up in a summit in Copenhagen in the 1990s. Essentially, it's 3 groups of criteria. The first is that states that want to come in need to have a functioning market economy that can withstand competitive pressures in the EU single market. Secondly, they need to have a stable democracy and reliable protections of individual rights and of minority rights. And thirdly, they need to be able to implement what is called the acquis communautaire, and that is all of the EU legislation that is currently in force. Remember, the EU is a constant producer of legislation, which is binding on the member states. So if a new member wants to come in, then it needs to adopt all of this existing legislation, and that might require so-called transposition of directives through decisions of their national parliaments or administrative acts to implement EU law. This is quite difficult for a state, quite a big political and administrative job to do. These conditions are structured by the EU into so-called chapters of the enlargement negotiations, where they will be discussed one by one, specified what exactly is expected of a state that wants to come in. But in the process, the EU is clearly in the driving seat because it can define when these conditions are satisfied. And this whole process is sometimes called conditionality. In the end, the member states, the existing member states, decide on enlargement, and because adding a new state is a change to the EU treaties, it must be ratified by all of the existing member states, also through their domestic ratification procedures.
EU enlargement has been politically contentious in the European Union, and some people even talk about enlargement fatigue in relation to it. How has this sentiment arisen, and what does it mean?
Well, as I briefly mentioned already, enlargement has made the EU more diverse internally, culturally and economically, and it has also made the EU more difficult to govern. And that is not always seen as a good thing, because it has created new conflicts and might have resulted in new areas where EU decision-making appears stalled. Secondly, there's some concerns often associated with enlargement, such as migration from poorer states that have joined the EU to the richer states, also concerns about some of the internal situation in these new states that have come in, which might be more or less justified, but there are concerns sometimes about human rights, about democracy, about labor rights, and so on in states that are in the queue for joining the European Union. And there have been concerns about some of the states that have already joined after enlargement backsliding on some of the achievements of the enlargement process. In particular, in Hungary and to a lesser extent Poland, there have been concerns about backsliding on democracy and human rights, and this is sometimes held up as a problematic example for states that join and then not really live up to the conditions of membership after they have joined the EU and have become an EU member state. So all of this has contributed to this sentiment of let's be skeptical about future enlargement and let's take it slow in accepting new member states.
What states are in the queue currently to potentially become members of the European Union?
The EU has formally recognized 7 countries as candidate states. These are Turkey, then in the Balkans, Serbia, North Macedonia, Montenegro and Albania, as well as most recently Ukraine and Moldova. All of these are at very different stages of the enlargement process. So it doesn't mean that they will necessarily become member states, and definitely it doesn't mean that they will become member states quickly, because this whole process of enlargement is a very lengthy process with a lot of veto points where the EU might say no, and in the end even the population in states that want to join might say no. But these are the states where enlargement is most seriously discussed. And they, of course, are also states that move the EU further into areas of its neighborhood with its own history and also its own history of conflict, including, for instance, concerns about the relationship with Russia as far as Ukraine and Moldova are concerned, concerns about the remnants of the Yugoslav civil wars as far as countries like Serbia are concerned, and concerns about the instability in the Middle East as far as Turkey is concerned. So this underscores as well why future EU enlargement is contentious, but the process is continuing, and any of these states may, over time, move closer to EU membership and eventually join the EU.
Thank you very much for your comments on these topics.
You're welcome.